My name is Boyd Callahan. I'm 56 years old, and my son called me 2 weeks before his wedding to tell me I wouldn't be welcome at the rehearsal dinner. His future mother-in-law had concerns, he said. She'd raised them politely, the way certain people are always polite when they're doing something unkind. I was standing in my workshop when he called. Wood shavings on the floor, the smell of Danish oil still in the air from a set of cabinet doors I'd just finished. I listened to my son explain, in a voice that kept apologizing without ever quite saying sorry, that the Whitmores had important guests coming, a federal minister, board members from 3 Bay Street firms, people who moved in a certain world, and his father, a carpenter from Scarborough, who drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, didn't move in that world. I told him I understood. He said he was sorry 4 more times before he hung up. I set the phone down on the workbench next to a letter I hadn't opened yet. It had arrived 2 days earlier, city letterhead, and I'd left it sitting there because I had a deadline on a heritage restoration contract and hadn't found the moment. I looked at it for a second, then went back to work. The letter could wait. I had a door to finish. Let me take you back to where this started. I got the wedding invitation in late spring, forwarded to the shop, because Wyatt knows I forget to check the mailbox at home. I opened it at the bench with a utility knife, and stood there reading it twice. My son's name printed beside Clara Whitmore's in navy ink. The venue was a private estate north of the city, out past King Township. I knew right away it was going to be something. The cardstock alone probably cost more than my first set of chisels. I called my brother that evening. He's 2 years older and the only other person who knew what it meant to me watching Wyatt grow up and get here. We lost his mother when Wyatt was 9, a heart thing, fast, the way those things sometimes go. One morning she was making oatmeal, and by afternoon she was in an ambulance. And 3 days later, my boy and I were sitting in a hospital corridor, being told what we already knew, but couldn't yet say out loud. I don't talk about that time much. There's not much to say that the work didn't already say for me. I built things, I held the shop together, I went to every school play and every hockey practice with sawdust in my hair and resin on my jacket. And Wyatt would find me in the bleachers and wave like it was exactly what he'd expected. Because it was. He grew up well, did a business degree at Western, got into commercial real estate, ended up working for a firm in downtown Toronto that handles development financing. Somewhere in all that he met Clara Whitmore at a charity gala. And somewhere after that, I met Clara's parents, Constance and Roderick, over dinner at a restaurant on Yorkville Avenue where the menu didn't have prices on it. Constance was gracious. That's the word. She asked me questions about my work, the way someone asks about the weather in a country they'll never visit, politely, without any real interest in the answer. Roderick was easier. He talked about development projects the whole evening, and seemed to assume I'd find it interesting, which I actually did. We have more in common than he thought, though neither of us knew it then. After Wyatt called to tell me about the rehearsal dinner, I drove out to the river where I used to take him fishing. It's an hour north of the city. Good water, quiet in the evenings. I do my thinking there when a problem's too big for the workshop. I sat on the bank until the light went, then I drove back. Wyatt came by the shop 2 days later. He parked his car, a leased Audi, which I mention only because I've never owned anything leased in my life, and stood in the doorway the way he does when he's not sure how welcome he is. I waved him in. He sat on the stool by the assembly bench and wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee and couldn't look at me for a while. "Dad," he finally said, "I want to explain." "You don't have to." "No, I do." He looked up. Clara's mother has a very specific idea of how things should look. The wedding is being covered in a magazine. Toronto Life, the homes and entertaining issue. There are going to be people there who Roderick does business with. She's worried that I'll embarrass them. He flinched. She's worried there'll be a mismatch. That's the word she used. A mismatch. I looked at my son. He was wearing a jacket that probably cost more than my first bandsaw. He was tired and uncomfortable, and trying to hold 2 worlds together with his hands and finding they didn't fit. "Whose decision was this?" I asked. He was quiet. "Yours or hers?" "Hers," he said, but I didn't say no, and that's on me. He was right, and I didn't let him off the hook for it. Not right then. Here's what I want you to understand about why I said what I said next. It wasn't weakness. I've been in situations where I had to hold a structure together past the point most people would have walked away, and I know what it costs to keep standing. I wasn't going to make my son choose between his father and his wedding day. That's a weight a man shouldn't have to carry into a marriage. So I told him what I knew to be true. I said, "Wyatt, I love you more than anything I've ever built. If staying away from the dinner makes your week easier, I'll stay home. But I want you to think about what you're agreeing to, and what you're setting up for the rest of your life. You don't have to answer me now." He left without answering. He would, eventually. The person who was less patient about all of this was Alec. Alec has been my foreman for 19 years. He started as an apprentice, when we were both young enough to think we'd never get tired, and he stayed because he's the best finished carpenter I've ever seen, and because we've never once had a disagreement about what work is supposed to mean. He came in the morning after Wyatt's visit, read my face the way he always does, and put his coffee down on the bench. "Tell me," I told him. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, in the specific tone he uses when he's about to say something he's already thought through, "You're going to let this woman decide whether you watch your son get married. It's a rehearsal dinner, Boyd. I'm not fighting that war at Wyatt's wedding, not on his behalf and not for my own pride. So you just disappear. You just make yourself easy to erase." I made a choice, I told him. There's a difference between being erased and choosing to step back for someone you love. Alec picked up his coffee and went back to the cabinet he was building and didn't say another word about it. But he didn't agree. He never agreed, and that matters because Alec went to the rehearsal dinner. Clara had asked him. She'd met him at Wyatt's birthday the previous year and liked him, which tells you something about Clara that I want you to hold on to. The daughter was not the mother. She'd grown up in that world, but she hadn't become it yet. She sent Alec an invitation because she'd wanted someone from my side of the room, even if I wasn't there. He told me about it on Saturday morning, sitting in the shop with the overhead lights on, and the city still gray outside. It was at the estate, he said. Tents and white lights. A string quartet playing in the corner. Constance Whitmore stood up at the table and gave a little speech about welcoming Clara into the next chapter of her life, and about how Wyatt was such a wonderful young man. And then she said, he paused. He said she'd thanked Wyatt's family for coming, and mentioned that his father, a skilled tradesman, had been too busy with his work to attend. Too busy. She said it, Alex said, like you'd said no yourself, like it was your call, like you had work on. I kept my face still. Some people at the table looked confused. Wyatt looked at the tablecloth. Clara looked at Wyatt. What else? Alec turned his mug around in his hands. There was a man there, architect type, older. I didn't get his name. When Constance said the tradesman part, he asked her what trade. She said woodworking, cabinetry. He said, oh, what shop? She said Callahan something, she thought. Alec looked up at me. The man went quiet. Then he started to say something and then stopped, like he'd caught himself. I sat with that. The letter was still on the bench. It had been there for 5 days by then. I picked it up that afternoon, after Alec left. It was from the City of Toronto, Heritage Planning Division. The city had received an application from the Whitmore Group to begin conversion of the Beaumont building on King Street West, a late Victorian commercial block that had been empty for years. Heritage designation meant any major structural or interior work required independent craft assessment before the planning committee would sign off. The city was formally requesting that Callahan Custom Millwork provide that assessment. My name, the letter said, had been recommended by the Toronto Preservation Board as one of 2 qualified practitioners in the region, with the expertise and professional standing to evaluate heritage-grade woodwork of this period. The other practitioner, the letter noted, had relocated to Vancouver. I read it twice, the way I read everything that matters slow. Whitmore Group. I got up from the bench and walked to the back of the shop where I keep the project binders. 19 years of work, catalogued by year. I pulled 2016 and opened it on the floor. There it was, the Meridian. 42 floors of premium residential on Adelaide Street West, the Whitmores' flagship completed project. The one Roderick mentions in every interview. The building that appears on the cover of their company brochure. The development that established the Whitmore Group as a serious name in Toronto luxury residential. We did the millwork. Every suite. Custom walnut built-ins, library walls, kitchen panels, entry millwork. 14 months of work, 22 craftspeople at peak, the most complex residential millwork project we'd ever taken on. It won a National Interior Design Award in 2018. The award certificate is in a frame above the coffee station in my shop. It reads Callahan Custom Millwork, Toronto. I sat on the floor of my own shop for a while, holding a binder from 6 years ago, and let the whole shape of it come together in front of me. Roderick Whitmore had spent years pointing to the meridian as the standard his company set. He used it in pitches, he used it at fundraisers. His company's website called it a landmark of craftsmanship. And the man whose hands built every inch of what he was pointing to was the same man his wife had decided was a mismatch. A smaller thing in my chest wanted to become something harder. I noticed that, I let it sit there, and I didn't feed it. Because here's the thing about wood, you can't lie to it. You can't build a chair and decide the joinery is good enough and expect it to hold. Either the work is right or it isn't. You can't let personal feeling into the work. The moment you do, the moment you let a grievance or a shortcut into the joint, the piece fails. Maybe not today, maybe not next year. But eventually, in the way that everything built wrong eventually fails. I'd built my whole career on that principle. I was not about to change it, because some woman in King Township had called me a tradesman in a tone that was meant to land like an insult. I called Raina, my office manager, the next morning, and told her to accept the heritage assessment. She knew the Whitmore name, small industry. She asked if I was sure. I'm sure, I said. We do it the same way we do everything. She said, all right. Clara came to the shop a week before the wedding. She came alone, without Wyatt, and she stood at the door in a way that told me she'd been working up to this. She asked if she could talk to me. I poured her a coffee and waited. I didn't know, she said, about the rehearsal dinner. I mean, I knew my mother had concerns, but I didn't know she'd made it sound like it was your decision. Wyatt told me everything last week. How is he? He's angry, at himself mostly. He should have said something sooner. She wrapped both hands around the mug, same gesture as her coffee. Family habit, maybe. I noticed it. She said, Mr. Callahan, I want you at the wedding, not just the reception. I want you at the ceremony. I want you to see your son get married. I told her I appreciated that. And then I told her something I meant. I said, Clara, your mother isn't the problem. Fear is the problem. Afraid the wrong person in the room changes how the room sees you. That's a very small way to live. You already know it's small, or you wouldn't be standing here. What I want you to think about, and you don't have to answer me, is whether you're going to keep borrowing her eyes or start using your own. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, Wyatt told me you built the meridian. I nodded. She laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd just understood the shape of a thing for the first time. My mother has a photograph of the Meridian lobby in her living room, she said. I know. She shook her head slowly. She left, and I watched her car leave the lot, and I thought, that young woman is going to be fine. 2 days before the wedding, Wyatt confronted his future in-laws. I didn't see it. Clara told me afterward, sitting in the same spot at my bench. It started over the seating arrangement. Constance had placed the few people from my side at a table near the bar, separate from the main room. Wyatt noticed the chart. He asked his future mother-in-law why. She explained about flow, about how guests tend to gather with people they know, about how it made logistical sense. He asked where his father was seated. There was a pause. Wyatt, she said, we discussed this. You discussed it, he said. I nodded along. That's not the same thing. Clara said the kitchen went very quiet. Constance started to say something about perception, and the magazine, and the guest list. And Wyatt said, my father built the Meridian. Clara said the silence after that was different from the silence before it. Constance blinked. I'm sure his crew did excellent work. He designed and built every piece of custom millwork in that building. The work your family has been showing off for 6 years. Wyatt's voice was even. He's the reason that building looks the way it does. And you've been telling people at dinner parties he's too busy to come. He didn't shout. Clara was clear about that. He said it the way you say something you've already thought through completely, quietly, in the tone you use, when you've made a decision that won't be changed. That's when Roderick came into the kitchen. He'd heard enough. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Constance, then he asked one question. What's the carpenter's last name? Wyatt told him. Clara said her father's face changed. She'd never seen it change quite like that before. He picked up his phone, walked back out of the kitchen, and closed the door. I was at home that evening when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I picked up. Mr. Callahan, a man said, "This is Roderick Whitmore. I think we need to talk." He came to the shop the next morning, the day before the wedding. He was a well-built man in his early 60s, dressed like he'd come from a meeting, but had loosened his collar in the car. He shook my hand firmly and looked around the shop the way people do when they're genuinely curious about a place they've never thought to look at before. He sat on the stool where Wyatt usually sits. He said, "I know about the heritage assessment letter. My planning team told me last week, and then my son told me everything else last night." I waited. He said, "I want to apologize, not because of the assessment, not because of the meridian, though I am, genuinely, blindsided by that. I want to apologize because my wife made your son feel he should hide you, and I let her. That's a thing a man should say to another man directly." I let him finish. Then I told him what I needed to say once clearly, so we could both move on. I said, "The assessment will be honest. If the Beaumont conversion is structurally and materially sound from a heritage standpoint, I'll say so. If there are issues, I'll document them. My professional opinion isn't a bargaining chip, and it isn't something you can offend me out of. Those are two separate things. Keep them separate." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You're not what I expected." I said, "Most people aren't." He smiled, just barely. There was something real in it. "I want to be at my son's wedding tomorrow," I said. "Not for you, not to make a point, because he's my son." Roderick stood up. He said, "You should be at the front of the room." He left. I went back to work. Here is something the Whitmores didn't know. I'd planned to stay home from the ceremony. I'd told Wyatt that. I'd promised to keep a quiet distance, and I keep my promises. But that morning, Clara called me. She called before anyone else was awake, from what sounded like the guest suite at the estate, and she said, "Mr. Callahan, I want you here, not at the back. I want you to walk in with us. I've already talked to Wyatt. He's been too afraid to ask you himself, because he thinks you'll say no to protect him." I put on the charcoal blazer I'd bought for Wyatt's university convocation, the one I'd driven 3 hours to be at, still smelling like the shop. I drove to King Township. The estate was beautiful. I'll admit that. Stone laneway, oak canopy, a tent structure in the back field, with warm light coming through the sides, even in late afternoon. The kind of place built to make people feel like they're somewhere that matters. Wyatt found me in the parking area. He was in his suit, and he looked the way he used to look as a kid when he'd done something he wasn't sure I'd approve of and was waiting to find out. Braced. Hoping. I hugged him first. We're not a family that says everything out loud. We never had to be. We stood there in the gravel for a minute. "You should have pushed back sooner," I told him. "I know. Don't let people decide what you're ashamed of. That's not a thing you hand out." He nodded. "Now go get married." The moment happened in front of everyone, though I hadn't planned it that way. After the ceremony, during the reception, I was standing near the edge of the tent with a glass of something I wasn't drinking, watching the room. Constance was making her way through the guests the way she always did, working the room. She hadn't acknowledged me. I hadn't expected her to. And then an older man in a gray suit crossed the room toward me, hand already extended. "Boyd Callahan," he said. "I thought that was you." I recognized him then. Gordon Frey, architect. He'd been the project lead on the Meridian, the man who'd called Alec and me into the design meetings back in 2015, who'd pushed for the custom millwork over the developer's preference for factory panels. He'd gone to bat for the budget. Without him, we wouldn't have gotten the work. We shook hands. He said, "I was at the rehearsal dinner. When they mentioned your name, I nearly said something then. I'm glad you didn't." He laughed. He turned to the man beside him, a city councilor I vaguely recognized, and said, "This is the man who built the Meridian interiors, the actual man, with his hands." The councilor shook my hand with both of his. He said he'd always wondered who'd done that work. He said it looked like something from another era. I thanked him. Gordon was already waving over someone else. Constance had stopped moving. She was about 10 feet away. and she was watching the knot of people form around me. The architect, the counselor, two of Roderick's business associates who'd turned to look, and she was trying to keep her expression managed. But I've been reading rooms for 30 years, the way a carpenter reads grain. I could see where the pressure was. Clara appeared at my elbow. She'd been watching too. She took my arm. She raised her voice just enough to carry. "Everyone," she said. "This is my father-in-law, Boyd Callahan. He built the Meridian. He's the best craftsman in this city, and the reason why it turned out as well as he did, and I want him beside me for the rest of the night." The room registered this. Constance registered it most of all. Wyatt appeared on my other side. He put his hand on my shoulder. Constance took a step forward. She said, of course he belongs here, I want to say this once," Clara said, not unkindly, but with the kind of steadiness that only comes from having decided something clearly. She said, "He belongs here because he's family. That's not something that changes based on who else is in the room. I need you to know that." Constance didn't have a response. I watched her look for one and not find it. In 30 years of working on houses and buildings, I've seen a lot of structures fail. Usually not all at once. Usually it starts at one joint, one place where the load didn't get transferred properly, and then slowly, quietly, everything around it adjusts. Constance's face in that moment looked like a joint that had just been overloaded. Roderick found me later by the bar. He didn't say much. He raised his glass in my direction. I raised mine. That was enough. I wasn't there for the toast. I was outside for a few minutes getting some air when Wyatt tapped the microphone and asked for quiet. Clara told me what he said, word for word, later that night. He said, "My father built things his whole life, not because he had to, because he believed the work was the point, because a thing made right holds. He built the cabinet in my childhood bedroom where I kept everything that mattered to me. He drove me to every practice and every game and every school thing, and he always smelled like the shop, and I never once had any doubt that I was the most important thing in his life. I didn't stand up for him the way I should have this month, and that's a mistake I'll carry. But he's here tonight, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that doesn't happen again." Someone clapped, then more people, then the whole tent. Alec was somewhere in the back. I heard him before I got back inside. We had a moment, Wyatt and I, late in the evening when the band was playing, and the older guests were starting to drift toward their cars. He found me at the edge of the tent, and we stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at his wife dancing with her university friends, her dress catching the light. "You happy?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "You?" "Getting there." He laughed. He has his mother's laugh, still, after all these years, a little unexpected, a little too big for the room. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to, when he was 9 years old, and needed something I didn't have words for. The heritage assessment took 4 weeks. I walked the Beaumont building 6 times. I went over the original construction records at the city archives, compared the surviving millwork samples against the period documentation, ran moisture readings on the load-bearing timber elements. I wrote 80 pages of findings. Here's the honest part. The building had problems, real ones. The original pine flooring on the 2nd and 3rd floors had been compromised by a roof leak that a previous owner had patched badly, and 2 of the decorative column casings in the main hall were concealing structural damage the preliminary report had missed entirely. If the conversion had gone forward on the original timeline, those columns would have needed emergency remediation within 5 years. Expensive, disruptive, and entirely avoidable. I could have passed it. Roderick was under pressure. The planning committee had already delayed twice. A clean assessment would have moved everything forward, made me convenient, made me the man who helped them out after everything they'd put me through. I didn't. I documented every finding. I specified what needed remediation before I could sign off. I sent it to the city and copied the Whitmore group, and I walked Roderick through the report myself, item by item, in a boardroom downtown that cost more per square foot than my whole shop. He was quiet for most of it. At the end he said, "If we'd built over those columns, people would have been living above them eventually," I said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me what you found." I said, "That's the job." I meant it simply. There was no subtext. It's just what the job is. That conversation was the last time the Whitmores were difficult. Constance sent a card after the assessment was complete. Formal, brief, the kind of note she probably sent to everyone. I didn't read too much into it. Some people change slowly, some people just adjust. I don't need to know which one she is. What I know is this. About a month after the wedding, Wyatt drove out to the shop on a Saturday. He came through the back door like he always has, poured himself coffee without asking, and sat on the stool. He said, "I talked to Mum yesterday." I looked up. He goes to the cemetery on the anniversary. He's done it since he was old enough to drive. I never told him to. He just started. He said, "I told her what happened, all of it, the dinner, the wedding, the assessment." He paused. "She would have loved watching you walk into that tent. Probably would have had something to say about the blazer." He laughed. We worked in the shop for the rest of the afternoon, him sanding a panel I was prepping, the way we used to when he was a teenager, and I'd drag him in on weekends. Neither of us said much. We didn't have to. My work is in buildings all over this city. Some of them people point to. Most of them they just use, without thinking about who built the thing their hands rest on when they lean against a door frame, or the way the drawer closes without a sound, because someone took the time to fit it right. That's always been enough for me. I've never needed the room to know my name. I just needed the work to hold. It always has.